Thank you, Inge. Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me from afar. Yes? Okay, great. Thanks again, Inge, for having me at your conference. I'm very sorry and very sad not to be in California. But well, it is what it is. There's too much going on in Holland at work at the moment. Okay, so I have a very old title, Doing Not Reading. And I'm going to explain what I mean with not reading and doing not reading in this talk, from focus to present. And well, let me just start. What is doing not reading? Well, it's perhaps not this boy falling asleep on a book. But it is the kind of reading where you are not entirely in control, where you are directed by the context of the text. So where you are an implied reader, I suppose. And when you are open in a way that allows you to be challenged by how a text makes you read and possibly be transformed by it. So not reading is not reading, but it's an openness in reading. And I'm going to tell you more about it. I don't think this is the right word, not reading. We may come up with another term, who knows. But what does this amount to, this not reading for the moment? And how does it relate to attentiveness, attention, focus, and concentration? So I'm a bit provocative in my talk here because I invoke not reading in relation to attention and attentiveness, because reading in the last 2 decades has been consistently connected to improving mindfulness. Okay, so mindfulness in the sense of sharpening your focus, sustaining your concentration, improving your concentration, also improving your memory and thinking skills, keeping your brain active and engaged, operating underworked regions of the brain, sharpening the mind, lowering your blood pressure, decreasing depression, improving brain connectivity, etc., etc. But most of all, reading has been related to mindfulness in a Western sense, okay? Mindfulness in a Western sense. So that in the end, reading is a meditative tool now. It's known as a meditative tool that helps individuals modulate, flex brain activity, concentrate, and enhance their imaginative, empathetic skills. Okay, so it's a tool from a special toolbox to make us better human beings. That's reading for us. Insights like these have by now cemented into commonplace beliefs, pushing reading, and especially literary reading, I would say, reading novels, into the domain of health, hence the smoothie. Reading helps to prevent Alzheimer's, remedy ADHD, which I maybe suffer from, and fight depression. So reading a novel is like having a smoothie full of spinach or kale. It's the same, yeah, it's a recipe for a better life, maybe. And all these insights are, of course, pretty wonderful for us as literary scholars, because they make us a lot more relevant and urgent. Our research becomes a lot more urgent, and this is why Marianne, who will speak after me, is doing 20 talks this week, I suppose, because it's such a topical topic, topical research. But now I started wondering if reading is now our foremost and favorite meditative tool in the age of media distraction, new media distraction. What do schools like Zen Buddhism, and I'm choosing Zen Buddhism, I'm not going to explain why, but just here I'm going to choose for Zen or Chan Buddhism, Chan in Chinese, which have fostered meditative practices for over 1500 years. What do they make of reading, these schools? What can we learn about reading here, given that assumptions about reading in present-day research converge precisely on mindfulness? on how reading enhances concentration. Okay, so let's go to Chan Buddhism. Oh, here's of course the sign. Let's begin in the golden age of Chan Buddhism in China during the Song dynasty between 960 and 1276. And when we talk of mindfulness in Western research, I'm sorry, the word Western, let's say the North Atlantic or whatever, but when we tend to speak of mindfulness, we are not having in mind awareness of unhealthy attachments, I think, when our general sense of mindfulness is concentration, and processing information in a very effective and efficient way. But in the context of Zen and Chan Buddhism, it means awareness of unhealthy attachment. So unhealthy attachments are attachments to illusions of stability and constancy, of permanence, illusions of self being permanent, of life lasting forever, of relations or possessions. And all these attachments cause suffering because reality is inherently impermanent and nothing is ever going to change that. So things don't last, and neither do they have an independent existence. So they're not separate, they're not stable, they're not real in that sense. So mindfulness means a whole lot more than concentration alone. And when in Zen reading is invoked in relation to mindfulness, it only has to do with an awareness of life as impermanent and of things arising dependently, that is to say, in close connection to each other. It's never just focus. Right. So here are my two definitions again: mindfulness and awareness of unhealthy attachment. And okay. Let's move on to David Wright, who has written a nice book on Zen, Buddhism and philosophy. And he has a separate chapter on reading in Zen, very interesting. And reading in Zen, he claims, can only bring understanding under certain circumstances, and only by means of certain reading practices, not by all reading practices. So reading is not by definition good and right, as well, especially literary scholars often tend to think. So it's not just good and right because it helps us zoom in on certain information and process that information efficiently, but reading only brings about mindfulness when it is a truly experiential activity. So when it is effective, when it does something to someone to take them to a different space. That's basically an experiential activity. And furthermore, reading can only become such an experiential activity when you as a reader have an open mind, a flexible open mind during reading. So when you are all prepared, when you're all set, when you're full of judgment, or when you have this a priori commitment to a text because you love the genre or because you love the teacher or the theory, that won't get you very far in terms of mindfulness, because then your mind is sealed off already before the experience begins. So there is an ambiguous relation to reading in Zen Buddhism. It can be good, but it may not always be a good thing. It's not beneficial by implication, but only insofar as it is a vehicle that increases mindfulness or awareness of impermanence. And because it can only work as such a vehicle when it is effective, so when it becomes an experiential act, reading needs to be more than just a mental activity to build this increase. It also needs to be of the body. So it's a text, the meanings of a text will not just surface on a cognitive level, but in what I here call reflexive application. So when meanings of the text become performative effects. So when the text makes you experience what it purports to do. And this is not necessarily that it makes you feel what the text says, but precisely how the text does. So in its materiality, in its rhetoric, and other kinds of tricks that a text can play on you. Okay, so now let's look at a 12th century poem from the Song dynasty, the golden age of Chan Buddhism in China. Oops, I forgot one here. By the poet Yang Wan Li, who was a very experimental poet in his older age, very special. And he wrote the following poem from which I got the title for this talk. And so it goes. Don't read books. Don't chant poems. When you read books, your eyeballs wither away, leaving the bare sockets. Sorry, I have to laugh about this poem always. When you chant poems, your heart leaks out slowly with each word. People say reading books is enjoyable. People say chanting poems is fun. But if your lips constantly make a sound like an insect chirping in autumn, you will only turn into a haggard old man. And even if you don't turn into a haggard old man, it's annoying for others to have to hear you. It's so much better to close your eyes, sit in your study, lower the curtains, sweep the floor, burn incense. It's beautiful to listen to the wind, listen to the rain. Take a walk when you feel energetic, and when you're tired, go to sleep. I'm sure many of us recognize what the persona has to say to us here. I don't know how often you have sat behind your computer thinking, why am I not in the swimming pool? Or why am I not in the forest? What's this unhealthy job doing to my neck? Etc., etc. Now, well, you could say that this poem, and this is especially for Inge, has an unreliable persona with a good sense of humor. It makes you read so as to make you not read. But while the poem tells you to not read, it is still only through reading that the poem shows you the way. To observe whatever is in or around you, to sit in silence, possibly without judgment, to walk or do whatever else comes naturally to you without effort, and to shrink the ego. And this is what I like most about this poem, especially after what we've heard about making, seeking attention online and everything. That's not important. Do not recite poems, do not make yourself heard, do not make space for yourself, because it's annoying for others to have to hear you. So reading distracts from mindful presence, from being present in the moment and aware of your entanglement with nature. Listen to the wind and the rain instead. So now comes the question, what's the kind of experiential activity that this poem generated in me? Well, I think it's something like this. It's so inconsistent, this poem, that it speaks to me almost subliminally. Be flexible, because the poem turns this way, then that way. You don't know where you stand. So be flexible. Do not grow attached to your thoughts, convictions, or position. Everything can change every second. Move with that change. So this is not what the poem says, again, but it is how it makes me feel subliminally, so to speak. There's another poem by the same poet, these sudden turns in his work are called the Chengzai style, because stuff will happen that is so unexpected that you are like almost slapped in the face, like the Zen masters used to do, to really wake you up. And this poem is full of those turns. It goes like this. A young boy removes the morning ice from a metal bowl and hanging it on a colored string makes it into a silver gong. As he strikes it, a jade chime resounds throughout the woods, when suddenly the tinkle of glass shattering on the ground. So what you have here is multiple illusions alternating each other and being broken, the one after the other. And every time you think, oh, it's a metal ball. No, it's ice. No, oh, maybe it's glass. And you're being turned around as a reader constantly from one shattering illusion to the next. So the poem includes me reflexively in a process of constant adaptation. And the main strategy of this poem is to startle me. Wait a minute, what? Metal, ice, glass, this is an illusion, another one, it doesn't stop. So by startling me, the poem alerts me to the nature of illusions, to not grow attached to things or scenes or persons in life. They can be shattered just like that, as we are now, for instance, witnessing in Europe. There's another poem. He has so many great poems, but whatever he does, he startles you into awareness. And again, it doesn't really matter what he says, but how he's saying it. One final one here. It's a scene on a river. The long river has no wind. The water is level, green. Neither shoe leather wrinkles, nor even gauze ripples. As one gazes east and west, the light floats in the void, gleaming like a faultless jade for 1,000 acres. The boys in our boat can't stand being idle, so they drunkenly pick up the flute and play amidst clouds and haze. With one sound, pure and long, it resounds, piercing the sky. A mountain ape crying at the moon, a spring falling in torrents. Then they beat their small sheepskin hip drum, head erect like a green peak, hands falling like rain. Suddenly, in midstream, one huge fish leaps and smashes the glass water for over a yard. But this is a typical charm scene where suddenly in the midst of calmness and laziness and mist, something arises, a huge fish in this instance, to really cut through the complacency. Life suddenly emerges. So what is this kind of reading that I try to illustrate here? Being startled, basically. What is it good for? It's not a long sustained activity that improved your theory of mind, I think. So hence, for instance, your empathy. It's not like we're reading a novel here. It's an activity that, like good humor, resolves much more around sudden turns, around change and disruption. Anytime anything can happen, an interruption will occur to reset a scene and rearrange a perspective. So this markedly differs from the kind of reading following the conventions of the novel, for instance, with you expecting the conventional processes so that you start with an a priori commitment. That kind of reading would not lead to the experiential awareness promoted in Zen Buddhism. It would lead precisely to distraction. Reading is really considered distraction in Zen Buddhism, enclosing you in a virtual world, and of course in a world also of book knowledge that we are all participating in and we all take very, very seriously on top. So it's nice because this makes you think, okay, the world of thinking, is that the best world for us to be in, or are we making a huge mistake here, perhaps? Well, I was thinking that Yang Van Lee's poetry, like a lot of other experimental poetry, makes you think of reading otherwise, in terms of brevity, fickleness, frivolity, capriciousness, and inconsistency. it makes me think of, well, my own slightly ADHD brain as an idea for readerly receptivity instead of being its deviation. A mind being constantly in motion, flexible, adaptable, taking on different perspectives and welcoming the other or the new. And so normally, of course, reading is a way to manage ADHD, where here ADHD would become the model for reading. Oh, sorry. So this a mind like this may have a much more realistic sense of reality than the other model. Because here, reading poetry, reading the unexpected, renders your mind flexible so that it opens. And not knowing, not understanding is crucial for an open mind. So being startled is the best setup to become aware. So you stay in process. And that's the connection between that kind of interrupted reading, startling reading, and mindfulness. Okay, so not reading poetry does helps to foster an open mind. And then we can open up to some of the basic insights of Zen Buddhism and other forms of other schools of Buddhism, to become aware of the fact that you don't exist as a self that is an entity. There is nothing stable about you. You're just an aggregation of 5 different elements that keep changing every nanosecond. And this sort of restlessness is something that is much more in tune with the kind of reading that I've been trying to illustrate here. So it sort of prepares you for insights like these, the kind of reading that I've been describing here. And I know this is just still a thought experiment. It's not a serious research yet, but I think it's an idea that I would like to pursue more. In fact, I'm concluding a book on East Asian philosophy as a critical frame for literary texts, and this is part of that book, obviously. But I wanted to share this with you, my thought experiment, and to think what you think of it, to see what you think of it, and to see if we can also have different purposes and different means of reading, rather than always the model being the novel and the long sustained reading that the novel provides. And that we, for instance, look at poetry and to find that there are many, many other ways of reading and creating awareness and concentration. And that was my contribution. Oh yeah, I have to stop sharing.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kiene. I think that last thing you said, like text length, is something that I'm also thinking about a lot. And I'm also very curious to hear what Marian has to say about it. But I just wanted to say that I think this is such a nice development from your earlier work, because it kind of combines all these interests, and you've been publishing on creativity and experimental literature and materiality. And I see it kind of all coming back here. So that's really exciting to me. My question would be, for that kind of experience that you described, what would be the preconditions? Because you have shared with us a number of poems that I think really embody this kind of reading quite well, and you get an immediate sense of it. But I could also imagine reading these poems just to put them into a presentation or in a book, and you're in a hurry and you need like good examples for them, or in an educational setting where you're actually thinking about like meeting your boyfriend after class or that kind of thing. So the text itself might not be enough. And you say you need an open mind, but it's also it's also priming you to have an open mind. And then what your reading goals might be, like, do you want them for information? Are you reading for an experience, like time pressure, that kind of thing? So I wonder, like, what would be the ideal context for this kind of reading?
Yes, well, that's a very good question, because that will differ all the time. And I think will never be the same. Yeah, that will be different for everyone. for me, it really struck me, and everything sort of converged for me when I read this poem, and I thought, oh wow, there's so much in this poem. It's so funny, but it's so philosophical, and yeah, for me it did the trick, because I had read so much on Buddhism and Zen Buddhism, and tried all kinds of meditative practices. And then I started recognizing what literature might contribute there as well. So I guess no, I would not want to extrapolate what would be the best context for reading for everyone, because it would be different for everyone in every moment.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Otherwise, you get this list of steps like, okay, sit down and like close the curtains and then it will happen. It makes me think of Susanna Paasonen's account of micro shocks and micro events as well, as something you say startles you, something that overcomes you, but it's not easy to operationalize, or it's not something that will happen on demand. So might be
No.
exactly what we need.
No, yeah, this is why in well, earlier times people would get a slap in the face or worse to get to some kind of awareness. No.
Maybe just one more question before we go on.
Yes.
Thank you for that talk. That was wonderful. I was thinking about firstly, I was thinking about taking the intellectual account that you were offering of Zen and Chan and bringing it back to late 20th century Western literary accounts of the history of literary theory. And particularly, I was thinking of kind of the utilitarianism in Burke's equipment for living, right? So that the way that literature as equipment for living is a kind of, aligning with this utilitarian account of a sort of a toolbox and a tool. And then thinking about things like in reader response theory, Louise Rosenblatt's literature as exploration. And I was wondering the extent to which Rosenblatt, like when she talks, I think it's chapter 2, she talks about literary experience, right? And she's using these words, exploration, experience, and is really sort of focused on this idea of embodied presence in the moment of reading as a real thing, which is different from the world, but is of the life world of the reader. And so I'm kind of wondering if there are if we could recuperate from a Western literary theory tradition moments of recognition or echoes of when we use the lens that you are historically developing to kind of reread Western theory. So that's I'm sort of just asking broadly, do you see moments of recognition when looking through the lens of your current project? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, well, Louise Rosenblatt, that's great that you suggest her, because yeah, I've worked with her work a long time ago, and now that you mention her, I think yes, I need to include her. So you're asking if I can connect to like Western theorists in trying to bring East Asian philosophical frames to literary texts, right?
Yes, if we might reread Rosenblatt or Burke or other people differently through the distinctions that you were discovering from this other perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, I haven't thought distinctly about these critiques, but yeah, I'm sure. Well, I'm sure it will bring very, very interesting connections and maybe also confrontations.
Mm-hmm.
You can also think of Roland Barthes, for instance, who wrote on haiku, but from a very Suzuki perspective, so to speak. Well, it has been so, especially the American literary scene has been so hugely influenced by maybe Tibetan Buddhism rather than Zen Buddhism alone in the from the 1930s onwards already, that you can hardly disconnect it to. And I think in my book that becomes really clear, the extent to which American criticism especially has been indebted to Buddhist frames of thought without specifically indicating it. So you'd be surprised Bell Hooks, Tina Turner. Well, that's not criticism, but well, many others have been engaged with Buddhism in criticism and in literature at the same time. So the connection is already very much there. And when you, by the way, mention Rosenblatt, well, we can also think of John Dewey as a very interesting thinker in relation to more experiential activities of art and reading. So I hope that satisfies you as a first answer.
Thank you so much, Kiene. We're a little pressed for time because thanks to the technical difficulties. So thank you for staying awake for us and sharing this wonderful story.
See you soon.